In a marriage that should celebrate love, an adult bride heard in front of everyone a cruel promise, "I will never touch you." What began as a cold agreement between families transformed into a silent coexistence where contempt and pride shared the same roof. But while he hid behind traumas and control, she discovered a strength that no one expected, not even herself. And when the game turns, the one who always had the power might be the first to lose it. Before diving into this intense story of pride, emotional wounds and unexpected twists, leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters of this saga that will hook you from beginning to end. The limousine stopped in front of number 847 on Europa Avenue with an almost offensive smoothness, as if the entire world should fall quiet before that address. Inside the vehicle, Isabella Montero adjusted for the last time the skirt of the navy blue dress her mother had chosen for the occasion. It was an expensive piece, borrowed, and that said everything about the state in which the Montero family found themselves. 31 years old, a graduate in administration from FGV, 3 years working in a consultancy that paid well enough for her to support her own apartment in Italium. She had plans. She had a life that was beginning to make sense. And then her father called on a Tuesday afternoon, with that voice she only recognized when something had broken beyond repair. Montero Agro, a company founded by her grandfather, built by her father, inherited with pride, and managed with a dangerous combination of tradition and stubbornness, was on the brink of collapse. Debts contracted over years of reckless expansion, a harvest destroyed by out-of-season frosts, and a bank loan that would come due in 60 days without any prospect of refinancing. Her father was 62 years old and had eyes that no longer held the weight of hope. What he proposed was not a question. It was a confession disguised as a request. Henrique Vargas Neto, heir and president of the Vargas Group, one of the largest infrastructure and agribusiness conglomerates in the country, was willing to inject enough capital to save Montero Agro, renegotiate the debts, absorb part of the operation, and ensure the family name did not disappear from the pages of the company her grandfather had built. There was only one condition, and her father said it with his back to her, looking out the office window as if he couldn't face what he was about to ask. Henrique wanted a bride, not for love, for strategic convenience. The merger of the families would also seal the merger of the businesses, create a narrative of solidity for investors, and give the Vargas Group something that numbers alone couldn't buy, an image of family continuity. And Isabella was the eldest daughter, single, with a clean record and an adequate presence for the circles Henrique frequented. She went 3 days without responding, then she signed. The engagement dinner took place in a private room at the Fasano, with 20 people around a long table covered in crystal and white orchids. Isabella met Enrique Vargas Neto in person that night. They had only exchanged formal messages through lawyers until then. He was taller than she imagined, with a face that could be considered handsome if it weren't for the permanent expression of someone who is calculating something. Well-cut dark hair, a tailored suit, a watch on his wrist that cost more than the car she had sold to help with her father's debts. He greeted her with a handshake. Not a kiss on the cheek, not a hug, not any gesture that suggested familiarity or affection. A firm, brief handshake as if he were closing a deal with a supplier. The dinner proceeded with conversations that had everything except real substance. The mothers exchanged pleasantries about floriculture and trips to Europe. The fathers discussed numbers with the coded discretion of those who know they shouldn't mention the elephant in the room. Henrique spoke little, responded with precision when addressed, and never initiated a conversation with Isabella. She tried twice, once about the menu, another about an exhibition she had seen at MASP, and received monosyllabic answers that closed any opening before she could even find her footing. It was at the moment of the toasts that everything changed. His father, Geraldo Vargas, a 70-year-old man with the authority of someone who never needed to raise his voice, raised his glass and made a brief speech about the importance of lasting alliances. Then he passed the word to his son. Henrique stood up, buttoned his jacket in an automatic gesture, and looked at Isabella with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't cruelty, it was something colder. It was deliberate indifference. "Isabella," he said, and his voice was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that fills a room without needing volume. I want you to understand, from now on, what this agreement means. You will live in my house, you will have access to all necessary resources, and you will carry the Vargas surname with the dignity it demands. In exchange, the Montero family will receive everything that was agreed upon. He paused for 2 seconds. 2 seconds that Isabella would never forget. But I need to be honest before everyone here. I will never touch you. The silence that followed lasted less than 3 seconds, but it weighed like an hour. Isabella's mother slightly dropped her fork. Her father did not move. Geraldo Vargas sketched something that could have been a smile of approval for his son's frankness. Enrique sat back down with the same composure of someone who had just announced a business decision. Isabella did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She picked up the champagne glass in front of her and took a long sip, slowly, looking at the center of the table. She felt everyone's eyes on her, some with thinly disguised pity, others with that cruel curiosity of those who want to see how someone reacts to a public humiliation. She did not give the satisfaction of any visible reaction, but inside something broke with a crash that only she heard. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in a ceremony at the Palacio Tangará, with 300 guests and a dress that weighed 4.5 kilos. During the exchange of rings, Enrique looked at her briefly, with that same calculated expression, and she thought, this man has never truly seen me. Not because he hasn't looked, but because he decided not to see. In the speech he made before the guests, because it was expected that he would, he repeated with slightly different words the same sentence. He said the marriage was a partnership based on mutual respect and clear commitments, and that he believed transparency was the foundation of any lasting relationship. Some guests nodded in approval. Some looked at Isabella with that pity she had already learned to detect and ignore. She smiled throughout the entire reception. She danced when it was expected she dance. She thanked for the gifts with grace. And when the last guest left, and she climbed the stairs of the mansion in Higienopolis that she would now call home, she entered the room that had been prepared for her, separated from his by an entire hallway, carefully took off her wedding dress, and sat on the edge of the bed in the most complete silence she had ever experienced. There was nothing to do that night other than begin to understand the size of what she had chosen, and to decide in silence that this place would not define her, that this man would not define her, that the words spoken before 300 people could humiliate her, but they could not destroy her unless she let them. Isabella Montero, now Isabella Vargas on paper, lay down on the 1,200 thread count mattress and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be different, not better necessarily, but different. And for now, different was enough to keep going. The Higienopolis mansion had 7 bedrooms, 4 living rooms, a library that occupied half of the 2nd floor, and an internal garden that Isabella discovered in the 3rd week of marriage, almost by accident, while getting lost in a corridor she hadn't yet fully explored. It was a house designed to impress, and it succeeded effortlessly. But houses designed to impress are rarely designed to welcome, and this was no exception. In the first few days, Isabella tried to establish some routine that would give meaning to her presence in that space. She woke up early, had breakfast in the large kitchen while the cook, Donna Grasa, prepared the meal in respectful silence. Enrique had already left before 7 in the morning on most days. She would hear him for the first time during dinner, if he dined at home, which was not guaranteed. There were weeks when he appeared only 3 or 4 times at night, always with his jacket folded over his arm, his phone in hand and that closed expression she had already learned to recognize as his natural state. The dinners were the hardest part. Not because of hostility. Enrique was never hostile, at least not openly. It was because of the total absence of interest. He sat at the head, she on his right side as the table arrangement determined, and the silence settled in with a naturalness that seemed rehearsed. Isabella tried in the first few weeks. She asked about his work, about the Vargas Group's projects, about a report she had read in Valor Económico mentioning the company's expansion in the Northeast. He responded, always polite, never rude, but with answers that ended the conversation rather than opening it. Complete, correct sentences, and completely devoid of any emotional opening. She stopped trying in the 5th week. What no one had mentioned before the wedding, and what she was discovering little by little, like someone finding the hidden rooms of an old house, was that Henrique had an intense social life outside that mansion. Business dinners, gala events, openings, board meetings, trips to Brasilia and São Paulo for meetings that lasted days. And when there were events that required a spousal presence, and there were, with a frequency Isabella hadn't anticipated, she was informed by his assistant, an efficient woman named Patricia, 48 hours in advance, about the dress code, the time, and what was expected of her in terms of social behavior. It was a choreographed existence. She was a beautiful and well-dressed accessory, and both of them knew it. What saved Isabella in that period, she would only understand this much later, was the library. On a Thursday afternoon, with rain hitting the high windows and no commitments on the horizon, she entered Henrique's library on impulse and stood still for almost a minute before the shelves. There were thousands of books organized with a logic that would take her weeks to decipher. Not alphabetical, not by theme, but by some particular criterion that revealed more about that man's mind than any conversation they had had. Philosophy next to engineering, Russian novels interspersed with leadership manuals, Brazilian concrete poetry leaning against treatises on behavioral economics. She picked up a Jorge Amado novel she had read in her teens and settled into the leather armchair by the window. She stayed for 3 hours without moving. Henrique arrived while she was still reading. She only noticed his presence when she heard the footsteps stop at the doorway. She raised her eyes from the book and met his gaze, brief, assessing as always, but this time with something different. It wasn't quite surprise. It was more like involuntary recognition, as if he hadn't expected to find her there, and the image was slightly incompatible with the category in which he had filed her. "You may use the library as you wish," he said, and his voice had that deep and controlled texture she already knew. "The books are not decoration." "I know," she replied, and returned to the book without further ceremony. He stood still for 2 more seconds that she didn't see but felt. Then his footsteps moved away down the hall. That night, alone in her room, Isabella stared at the ceiling for a long time. She wasn't sad, exactly. She was taking an honest inventory of the situation. She had a powerful surname she hadn't chosen. She had a house that wasn't a home. She had a husband who existed in the same house as her, like 2 planets in orbits that never crossed. She had enough money for anything she wanted to buy, except the only things that really mattered. But she also had time. More time than she had had in years. And a silence that, if she learned to inhabit it instead of fearing it, could transform into something useful. It was in that week that she found the piano. It was in a hall at the back of the east wing of the mansion, an area she avoided because it was far from her room and seemed to belong more to the house's past than its present. The piano was a black Steinway grand, impeccable, with the lid closed over the keys. She opened it carefully, like someone opening a letter not addressed to them, and played a single note with her index finger. The sound expanded through the empty hall with a resonance that made something move inside her chest. Isabella had taken piano lessons from age 6 to 17. She wasn't a virtuoso, she never had been, but she had a genuine sensitivity for the instrument, and the muscle memory of the pieces she had studied was stored in her hands in a way that surprises those who think the body forgets. She sat on the bench, opened her hands over the keyboard, and began to play a gymnopédie by Eric Satie that she had learned at 15. The notes came out imperfect at first, hesitant, with pauses where there shouldn't be. But as the minutes passed, something began to loosen, in her fingers, in her shoulders, in her breathing. She played for 40 minutes without stopping, without noticing the time. And when she finally raised her hands from the keys, there was a lightness in her body she hadn't felt since before her father's phone call. She didn't know Henrique was standing in the corridor outside, the door ajar, listening. She didn't know that day, she would only find out much later. But the fact was that he had passed by there on his way to his private office, and the chords of Satie stopped him with a force he hadn't anticipated and didn't know how to name. He stood still for a time he himself couldn't say precisely, and then continued on his way with the same composure as always, except for a slight contraction in his fingers, like someone resisting an impulse they don't yet recognize as such. That night dinner was the same as all the others. Polite silence, spoons against fine porcelain, the distant sound of the city outside. But Isabella, raising her eyes for a moment, had the impression that Henrique was looking at her for a fraction of a second longer than usual, before averting his gaze to his glass of water with that calculated precision she already recognized as a shield. She said nothing. She went back to her plate, but she kept that moment without knowing exactly why. The invitation arrived on a Monday, printed on thick cream-colored paper, with the Moreira Salles Institute's crest in relief. A gala dinner celebrating the centennial of the foundation of one of the country's largest art collections. Patricia, Henrique's assistant, sent along a handwritten note, the only means by which she communicated things she considered delicate, informing that the couple's presence was expected and that the dress code was strictly black tie. Isabella looked at the invitation for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her friend Camila, who worked as a personal stylist for high-level São Paulo clients, and who had been, in the years before the marriage, one of the few people with whom Isabella could be completely honest. "I need a dress that says I exist," Isabella said, without preamble. Camilla paused briefly. "Finally," she replied. The dress Camilla chose was emerald green, with a low back and a cut that valued without exhibiting. Isabella tried it on the afternoon before the event and stood before the mirror for longer than was necessary, not out of vanity, but because the woman looking back at her was at once familiar and slightly strange. It was her, but with a presence that the last 2 months of invisibility had almost erased. On the day of the event, she went down the stairs at 8 o'clock at night and found Henrique in the main hall, in a tuxedo, with his hair slightly different than usual, less rigid, closer to something that could be called natural. He looked at her when she came down, and this time the look lasted longer than the others, enough for her to notice, and enough for him to notice that she had noticed. Neither said anything. They went to the event in the armored car, in silence, as always. The Moreira Salles Institute received about 200 people that night, in a hall decorated with installations that conversed with the institution's photographic collection. Isabella knew the space. She had visited exhibitions there before the marriage, when she was still just Isabella Montero, and the familiarity of the place was a small and unexpected relief. What changed that night was something she hadn't planned. As Henrique Vargas Neto's wife, she had grown accustomed to existing as an extension of him at social events. She stayed by his side, smiled when appropriate, answered questions about herself with the safe brevity of someone who has learned not to reveal too much. But that night, in a sequence of small accidents, she became separated from him right at the arrival. A group advisor intercepted him for an urgent conversation, and she was left alone near one of the photographic installations. It was then that the curator of the exhibition, a middle-aged man named Raphael with round glasses, approached her to ask what she thought of one of the photographs on display, a black-and-white image of a woman washing clothes in a river in the interior of Bahia taken in the 1940s. Isabella wasn't prepared for the question and, for that very reason, answered without the usual filter. She said what she really thought about the composition, about the weight of the image, about what that woman carried on her shoulders besides wet clothes. Raphael looked at her with genuine surprise and introduced her to 3 other people who were nearby. And suddenly, without her having planned it, Isabella was in a real conversation, not choreographed, not performative, about art, about visual memory, about what images preserve that words cannot. It was the first conversation of its kind she had had in 2 months. She felt its warmth, the living texture of exchanging ideas with people who were truly listening. Henrique found her 40 minutes later, still in that circle, gesturing slightly while she spoke. He stayed a few meters away, waiting for a natural pause to approach, and in that interval observed her in a way different from all the other times. Not as an inventory item, as a person who was doing something he didn't expect her to do. When she saw him, she didn't interrupt the conversation immediately. She finished the reasoning she had started, said goodbye naturally to the group, and went to meet her husband. He said nothing about what he had witnessed. But in the car, back to Higienópolis, the silence had a slightly different texture, less empty, more like thought. In the weeks that followed, Isabella began to build a routine that was genuinely hers. She continued using the library. Enrique never questioned it, and she interpreted the silence as implicit permission. She returned to the piano with a regularity that increased organically, from 40 minutes to an hour, from an hour to 2. She discovered that the mansion's internal garden had a neglected part at the back where aromatic herbs grew without any criteria, and she began to care for them in a silent morning ritual that anchored her at the start of the day. But what transformed her most in that period was dancing. On an afternoon when Donna Grassa had left early, and the house was completely empty, Isabella turned on the sound system in the living room, something she had never done before, as if she needed permission no one had given, and put on a playlist that mixed Brazilian jazz with Cuban bolero. And she danced, alone, without technique, without method, just with her body responding to the rhythm with the freedom that the rest of her life there had not yet found. She danced for an hour. When she stopped, she was slightly breathless, and with something in her eyes that if someone had been there to see, they might have called joy. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet, but it was the first solid sign that she was capable of building something within that existence she had accepted, that life hadn't stopped on the day she signed the contract, that Isabella Montero still existed beneath the Vargas surname she had assumed. Enrique began to notice the changes the way closed-off people notice things, not directly, but through the side effects. The piano that used to be silent now sounded in the afternoons. The library had bookmarks in books he hadn't touched in years. The back garden, which he had ignored since the mansion was his, was different, more orderly, with small new pots next to the herbs someone had clearly replanted with care. And at dinners, when he arrived and she was already at the table, there was a different quality of presence in her, not the discreet tension of the first months, a tranquility that didn't depend on his approval to exist. He sat, served his plate, and sometimes found her looking at him with an expression he didn't know how to classify. It wasn't hostility, it wasn't a plea, it was just observation, as if she were studying him with the same attention she dedicated to the books in the library. This bothered him in a way he preferred not to examine closely. One night at the end of dinner, while Isabella was getting up to leave, he said, almost without apparent intention, as if the words had come out before a conscious decision, "You played Debussy this morning. Clair de Lune." She turned, her hand on the chair. "Yes," she said without revealing surprise. "Did you hear it?" "The house has good acoustics," he replied, and there was something in the way he averted his gaze to his water glass that was different from all the other times he had averted his gaze. She spent a second looking at him, then she said with a tranquility she herself didn't know she had built, "I'm glad it reached your ears. Good night, Enrique." And she climbed the stairs without hurrying her pace, leaving him sitting at the table with a silence that, this time, was entirely filled by her absence. The 4th month of marriage brought with it the first São Paulo winter. Isabella lived in that house, and with it a change in the mansion's rhythm she hadn't anticipated. The nights grew longer, the city's damp cold entered through the gaps in the old windows, and Enrique, for reasons she didn't know, began to dine at home with a slightly higher frequency than usual. Not that this had altered the nature of the dinners. They were still silent, still choreographed by the distance he maintained as a deliberate policy. But the higher frequency created something that the previous rarity had prevented: accumulation. And accumulation creates familiarity, even when neither of the two is seeking it. It was at this time that Isabella made a decision that had been maturing since the first month in the mansion. She called the director of the consultancy, where she had worked before the marriage, and asked if there was any possibility of remote work, by project, without a formal link. The director, a woman named Dr. Fernanda, who had bet on Isabella since the beginning of her career, paused shortly and said there was a restructuring project for a family business in the food sector that was without strategic leadership. It would be intense, it would be exactly what Isabella needed. She said yes before she finished the sentence. When Enrique found out, not because she asked permission, but because Patricia needed to adjust the schedule of some social events to accommodate her work commitments, his reaction was a brief pause before saying, without raising his eyes from the report he was reading, "That's fine." 2 words, No questions, no objections, without any inflection that revealed what he thought about it. Isabella took this for what it was: functional indifference, and she worked. The project consumed her mornings and part of her afternoons for 6 weeks, and it was like relearning to breathe. She had forgotten, or suppressed, how much she enjoyed it. The analysis, the strategy building, the conversations with entrepreneurs who had real problems that needed concrete solutions. It was a world completely different from the silent corridors of the mansion and the social events where she existed as an accessory. And then the Vargas family dinner happened. It was a quarterly ritual, she discovered, a meeting at Henrique's father's mansion in Jardins, with the main members of the family, Geraldo Vargas, his second wife Silvana, Henrique's 2 brothers with their respective families, and some cousins Isabella hadn't yet managed to completely memorize. It was a formal event disguised as informal, with all the tension that this type of encounter carries. Isabella had prepared carefully, not anxiously, but strategically. She knew the family dynamics well enough to know where the minefields were. The relationship between Henrique and the middle brother, Felipe, carried an old and never-resolved competitiveness. Silvana, the stepmother, was pleasant on the surface and calculating in depth, and Geraldo Vargas, an implacable patriarch, liked to test the people he didn't know well. What Isabella didn't expect was Carolina. Carolina Vargas, Henrique's younger sister, who lived abroad and rarely appeared at family events, arrived by surprise that night, coming from Lisbon, where she was doing a doctorate in comparative literature, with a red coat and the energy of someone who doesn't ask permission to occupy space. She was 28 years old, with dark eyes similar to her brother's but with a vivacity that never appeared in his, and she was the first person in that family who took Isabella's hands with genuine warmth upon being introduced. "You are much more interesting than I expected," Carolina said in a low voice, pulling Isabella to a corner of the room before dinner. "Everyone here is so predictable. Tell me about the real you." Isabella looked at her for a second, assessing. Then she spoke. Not about the marriage, not about the mansion, not about the narratives she had learned to present at social events. She spoke about the consultancy project, about the books she had read in recent months, about the piano, about the herbs in the garden. Carolina listened with an attention Isabella had forgotten existed, the attention of someone who is truly interested, not someone waiting for the next opportunity to speak. "You are brave," Carolina said when Isabella finished. "For having accepted the marriage?" "No. For having built a life within it without losing yourself. That is much harder than accepting or refusing." Isabella was silent for a moment. There was a precision in that observation that left her uncomfortable in the best possible way, the discomfort of being truly seen. Across the room, Henrique observed them. There was something in the way Isabella talked to his sister that he couldn't ignore, a fluidity, a lightness that he rarely saw in her at the events they were forced to appear in together. It was as if Carolina had released a version of Isabella that the mansion or he himself had kept contained. Geraldo Vargas approached his son during the cocktail, with a glass of whiskey in hand, and that expression of someone about to say something the listener won't want to hear. "She is better than you deserve," the father said without preamble, following his son's gaze. Henrique did not respond. "Your grandfather had a saying," Geraldo continued, swirling the glass slowly. "He said the only irreparable waste is what you do with the time you had and didn't use. Think about that." Then he moved away to receive another guest, leaving Henrique alone with a phrase he hadn't asked for, and that settled in a place he had tried to keep closed for a long time. The dinner itself proceeded with the controlled tension that characterized that family's meetings. Felipe made 2 veiled insinuations about Henrique's strategic decisions in the group. Henrique responded with precise numbers that ended the matter. Silvana dominated the conversation from her end of the table, with anecdotes about trips no one had asked about. And Isabella, sitting between Carolina and an affable cousin who worked in architecture, had one of the nights closest to normality she had lived since the wedding. On the way home in the car, Henrique said, without announcement, without context, "Carolina liked you." "I liked her," Isabella replied, looking through the window at the city lights. "She doesn't like many people. I know, she told me." Pause. What did you two talk about? The question came out different from his usual tone. It wasn't the question of someone performing protocol maintenance. It was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to know. Isabella slightly turned her head to look at him in the dark of the back seat. He was looking forward, his profile illuminated by the Paulista Avenue streetlights passing by the window. About books, she said. About what people build when the world around them doesn't collaborate. He did not respond, but she saw in the reflection of the glass a muscle in his jaw slightly contract, the only visible sign that something had reached where he didn't expect. And Isabella went back to looking at the city with a calm that was increasingly hers and thought, something is changing. She didn't know yet what it was, but the silence in that car had a different temperature from all the other silences they had shared. And difference, she had learned, was always the beginning of something. The crack, when it appeared, was not dramatic. It was a Sunday morning, with winter sun coming through the library windows and coffee cooling in a forgotten cup. Isabella was working on a financial analysis spreadsheet for the consultancy project when she heard different footsteps, not Henrique's precise and hurried rhythm leaving for work, but something slower, without a determined destination. She raised her eyes and saw him standing at the entrance of the library with his own cup of coffee and a folded edition of Fola that he apparently wasn't reading. It was the first time in almost 5 months that he appeared in the library while she was there. "May I?" he asked, and the word sounded slightly strange coming from him, as if it weren't a vocabulary he used frequently. Isabella looked at him for a second. "It's your library," she replied, and went back to the spreadsheet. He settled into the armchair near the opposite window. The distance was maintained, but there was something different in the simple fact that he had chosen that room at that moment. They stayed in silence for a time Isabella didn't measure. She worked. He flipped through the newspaper without the intensity of someone who is truly reading. "Restructuring of a family business," he said suddenly. She raised her eyes. He was looking at her laptop screen with an assessing expression. "Food sector," she confirmed. 3 generations of management. The second generation created a governance structure that the third is inheriting without any capacity to sustain it. What is the main problem? She studied him for a moment. There was a different quality to the question, not protocol politeness, not filling silence. It was the question of someone who understands the subject and has genuine curiosity. They have a decision-making model that requires consensus among 5 heirs with divergent interests, she said. No strategic decision gets off the ground because there is always a blocking vote. The company is paralyzed in a model that worked for the grandmother and doesn't work for anyone else. Henrique considered this for a moment. "Have you proposed creating an independent executive board with binding operational decision-making power?" "I am building exactly that." A pause. "You know this type of structure." "I went through something similar in the Vargas group when I took over. My father resisted for 2 years before accepting that the old model was unsustainable. It was the first substantive personal information he had shared with her spontaneously in 5 months of living together. Isabella didn't make this seem like a revelation. She kept the same tone of technical conversation, but she recorded it. "How did you convince him?" she asked. "With numbers he had no way of refuting. Geraldo Vargas respects results above anything else. Emotional arguments don't work with him." A brief pause. "Nor with me." There was information in that last sentence that was more than technical. Isabella did not press it. She let the silence settle naturally and went back to the spreadsheet. Henrique went back to the newspaper. They stayed like that for another 40 minutes, in parallel, without the need to fill the space between them. And when he finally got up to leave, he had an international call scheduled for 11, he said, standing at the doorway, "The structure you are proposing works better if you include an annual review clause with metrics linked to the performance of each division. It gives legal support and takes the personal character out of the evaluations." Isabella took note. "Thank you." He left. She stayed looking at the note for a moment, and then at the empty door, and thought that there was something deeply strange and deeply revealing in the fact that the first real conversation they had had was about corporate governance. But it was a conversation, and conversations, she had learned in those months, were always a beginning. In the following days, the library became a different territory. Henrique appeared 2 more times on weekends, always with coffee, always with that quality of presence she was learning to recognize as his equivalent of being relaxed. There was no explicit affection, there was no dramatic change in the temperature between them. But there was contact, the kind that happens when 2 people stop actively ignoring each other. On a Saturday afternoon, she was playing the piano when he passed through the corridor of the hall where the instrument was. This time he stopped at the doorway, and she saw him before he averted his gaze. She continued playing. She was in the middle of a Scarlatti sonata, and he stood still without entering with his hand on the doorframe. When she finished the piece, there was a silence. "Did you play before the marriage?" he asked. "Since I was 6. I stopped in college for lack of time." She put her hands in her lap. "Why do you have a piano if you don't play?" A pause that lasted a second longer than necessary. "It was my mother's." Isabella processed this carefully. There was no mention of Henrique's mother in any previous conversation in the 5 months they had lived under the same roof. She knew from indirect references that she had distanced herself from the family when he was still young. She didn't know more than that. "Did she play well?" Isabella asked, keeping the tone light. "Very well," he said, and then, as if the next sentence had cost something he didn't usually spend, "It was the only thing she did without calculating the effects." Isabella was silent for a moment. There was a very old and very specific pain in those words, and she recognized it not by the intensity with which he had said them, which was almost none, but exactly the opposite. By the way he had said them as if they were neutral, when they clearly weren't. "I will play it well then," Isabella said, with a simple kindness that required no answer. He nodded briefly and left, but this time she didn't hear the footsteps move away immediately. There was a small pause of 2 or 3 seconds before the footsteps restarted in the corridor. That week, Camilla came to dine at the mansion for the first time. Isabella had assumed the right to invite people as part of the routine she was building, without asking for approval and without receiving objection. Henrique dined out, and the 2 women spent the night on the veranda drinking wine and talking with the frankness that only exists between old friends. "You are different," Camilla said at one point in the night. "Different how?" "More you. More planted on the ground." A pause. "What is happening with him?" Isabella considered the question with honesty. "He is beginning to see me," she said finally. "And he doesn't know what to do with it." "And you?" She said, looking at the distant city lights beyond the garden. "I'm discovering that building oneself within a difficult place is possible, and that it doesn't depend on anyone besides me." Camilla looked at her for a long time, with that kind of care only real friends have. "But do you still feel something for him?" Isabella did not respond immediately. She took a slow sip of wine, and then said with an honesty that surprised even herself, "I don't know yet. And for now, not needing to know is the freest thing I've ever felt." Camilla was silent for a moment, swirling the glass between her fingers. Then she said with that particular softness she had when she was being very honest, "You know that some people spend their whole lives without reaching that point, right?" "I know." Isabella looked at the dark garden beyond the veranda, with the smell of herbs coming light in the cold air. "But I had an advantage." "Which one?" "I was put in a place where there was no other way out besides growing." A small pause. "At the time, I wouldn't have called it an advantage, but now I can see it in another way." Camilla nodded slowly, with that expression of someone hearing something they will keep. Then she raised her glass in a simple gesture. Isabella raised hers. They drank in silence, with the city in the background, with winter preparing to give way, and with the kind of comfort that doesn't need words to exist. The Vargas Business Innovation Prize was the largest event on the group's calendar, an annual gala that brought together the main names in the Brazilian productive sector in a hall at the Grand Hyatt with a capacity for 500 people. It was, at the same time, a public celebration and a strategic demonstration of power, and Henrique was the gravitational center of all of it. Isabella learned of the event 10 days in advance, when Patricia informed her that a more active role was expected of her this time. It would be necessary for her to mingle more with the guests, to talk with the international partners arriving from Lisbon, Madrid and New York, and to appear alongside Henrique in the official photographic records. It was, in short, the event where she most needed to be Isabella Vargas and least anything else. She called Camilla again, this time without using the phrase, "I need a dress that says I exist." This time she just said, "I want a dress that is completely me." Camilla understood the difference and arrived 3 days later with a black tailored dress, without excesses, without performative sparkles, with a single detail that changed everything, an almost imperceptible gold embroidery on the hem that only appeared with movement. It was elegant without being restrained, powerful without being aggressive. It was exactly Isabella. On the night of the event, she prepared with a calm she herself recognized as new. There was no anxiety in the mirror. There was no need to check if she was adequate for others' eyes. There was only her, preparing to appear in a large space full of people with the same tranquility with which she entered the library or the garden. When she went down the stairs, Henrique was in the hall in his usual black tuxedo, but this time without the report or the phone in hand. He was just standing there waiting, and when she stepped down the last stair and he saw her completely, something happened that hadn't happened in any of the previous times. He stood still for a second that was long enough to have meaning. It wasn't just aesthetic admiration, though there was that too. It was recognition. It was as if, at that moment, he had seen not just the dress or the woman who had entered that marriage 6 months earlier, but the person she had become within that marriage. And the difference had surprised him in a way he clearly hadn't prepared a defense for. "You are ready," he said. It wasn't a question. "For some time," she replied, and there was a second layer in that answer that both noticed and neither commented on. The Grand Hyatt received them with the intensity that events of this caliber have: camera flashes, series of handshakes, conversations that need divided attention because there is never enough time for any of them. Isabella moved through the hall with a poise that was new even to her. She talked in English with the partners from New York about the prospects for Brazilian agribusiness, discussed in Spanish with a Colombian businesswoman about capital structure in emerging markets, and listened with genuine attention to an entrepreneur from Sierra talk about logistics in hard-to-reach regions. Henrique observed her when he thought she wasn't looking. She knew he was observing because she had learned in recent months to read the spaces around him the same way she had learned to read the silences. And what she read was no longer the calculated indifference of the first months. It was something more complicated than that. It was a man who had put a distance between himself and the world, and who was discovering, against his own will, that the distance was failing. The moment of rupture happened at 10:40 p.m. Isabella was in the center of a group of 6 people when Henrique approached from the side, not to fetch her, but to join the conversation, something he had never done before at any event where they were together. She felt him arrive without needing to turn. By the way the conversation around them slightly changed tone, the people recalibrating their presence to include his weight. He stood beside her, not outside the group, beside her. And when one of the people in the group addressed the next question to both of them, as if they were a pair who had complementary opinions about something, Henrique didn't answer immediately. He slightly turned his head toward Isabella, in a small gesture that to any observer seemed protocol, but that she felt for what it was: an open space, an unspoken question, a turn he was giving her before occupying the territory. She answered. He completed. And there was in that exchange, in those 60 seconds of public conversation, a fluidity that hadn't been rehearsed and that neither had expected to find. Afterward, when the group naturally dissolved, they stood side by side for a moment before the next interlocutor arrived. And in that brief interval, in a low voice, he said, "You impressed Morales." The Colombian businessman. He is one of the largest private equity funds in Latin America. He is not easily impressed. Isabella looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" A pause that had exactly the weight of a confession. "Because you deserve to know." It was a small phrase. To anyone who hadn't spent the last 6 months in that mansion, in silences built with the precision of walls, it would be just a courtesy. But Isabella knew what it cost for that specific man to say something like that. She knew because she had learned to read the topography of what he didn't say, and that phrase was, in his language, a much larger opening than the words made it seem. She didn't let him perceive that she had understood. She just said, "Thank you," and returned to the hall when the next group approached. But inside, something had shifted position. The night ended near midnight. In the car back, the silence had the same temperature as the night before the Vargas family dinner. Not empty, but full. Charged with unspoken things that had acquired enough weight to be felt even without a name. Halfway to Higienopolis, Enrique said, without taking his eyes off the window, "My mother would have liked you." Isabella stayed completely still for a second. It was the second time he mentioned his mother, and this time there was something different, not the controlled aridity of the first time, but a tiny, almost imperceptible vulnerability that she felt as if it were a very low-frequency sound the body detects before the consciousness processes it. "Why?" she asked with care. He did not respond immediately. When he spoke, it was with that voice he used when he was being precise about something that cost him. "Because you are not afraid of silence." And she said that people who are not afraid of silence are the only ones you can truly trust. Isabella stayed with that phrase for a long time after they arrived at the mansion and each went to their room. She lay in the dark, thinking about that man on the other side of the corridor who had built ice walls so efficient that he himself had forgotten there was fire on the other side. And she thought with a clarity that was at once liberating and difficult that she wasn't here to melt his walls. She was here to be herself, and if that eventually touched something in him, it would be his choice, not her doing. But that night, for the first time since the wedding, she fell asleep thinking about him. Not with bitterness, not with resentment, not with the dull pain of the first months. With a curiosity that had the form of a question still without an answer. Who was Enrique Vargas Neto, underneath all that he had built, so as not to be reached? The answer arrived on a night that hadn't been planned for it. It was a Thursday in early August, with dry cold and that low mist that São Paulo sometimes produces in winter, and that transforms the city lights into golden spots suspended in the dark. Isabella had stayed awake late working on the final presentation for the consultancy project, the version she would deliver the following week, and which represented 6 months of analysis condensed into 42 slides that needed to be perfect. Near 1 in the morning, she went to the kitchen to get water and found Enrique sitting at the table with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a single glass. He was in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, which was, for that man, the equivalent of being completely informal. There were papers scattered in front of him, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the window, at the mist outside, with an expression Isabella had never seen in him before. It wasn't the face of Enrique Vargas Neto, president of the Vargas Group, a calculated and untouchable man. It was the face of a man who was exhausted from carrying something too heavy for too long. She filled the water glass at the tap without making unnecessary noise. He didn't turn but said, without looking at her, "You are still awake. Final presentation next week." She stood still by the counter, holding the glass. "Are you okay?" A pause. "A negotiation that didn't close today. 3 months of work. What happened?" He turned his head, as if the question surprised him. Not the content, but the fact that she had asked with the tone of someone who genuinely wants to know. He sat looking at her for a moment. "Sit," he said. Isabella sat on the opposite side of the table, without moving the chair closer, leaving the space between them neutral. He told her about the negotiation, a merger he had worked on for months with a renewable energy company from the south of the country, which had collapsed in 12 hours because one of the minority partners had changed his position at the last moment, motivated by reasons that had more to do with a bruised ego than any rational business analysis. She listened. She asked a question, then another. They weren't comfort questions, they were technical questions, from someone who understood the universe he was describing. And as the conversation progressed, something in his face gradually changed. The exhaustion didn't disappear, but it made room for something more like presence, with the relief of being heard by someone who understands. They stayed in the kitchen for over an hour. At some point, Isabella grabbed a box of starch biscuits, that Donna Grasa always left in the pantry and placed them on the table without ceremony. Henrique took one without comment, and that tiny gesture, the domestic informality of that moment at 2 in the morning, had a completely different texture from anything they had shared until then. "Why did you accept?" he asked suddenly. Isabella didn't need to ask for clarification. She knew what he was referring to. "My father was destroyed," she said with direct honesty, "and I am the eldest daughter. There was a whole logic that I understood even without liking it. Your not liking it was clear. The engagement at the Fasano made it clear to everyone," she said without bitterness, just as a statement. He was silent for a moment. There was something building in that silence. She could feel it, like sensing rain before any cloud appears. "What I said that night," he began and stopped. "Oh, you don't need to explain now." "I'm not explaining, I'm trying," a brief pause, "to be honest about something that should have been different." Isabella looked at him directly. There was a quality in his voice she had never heard before, not the calculated precision of the businessman, not the coldness he used as a shield. It was the voice of someone coming out from under something. "I grew up," he said slowly, like someone choosing each word before releasing it, watching my father fade away because of a relationship that consumed him entirely. My mother was a person who loved with an intensity that didn't fit within any structure. She was brilliant, she was magnetic, and she was completely incapable of being faithful to anything, to a place, to a person, to a version of herself. She left when I was 15. Not all at once. It was a gradual disappearance that lasted years, and my father spent all that time waiting for her to go back to being the person she had been at the beginning. Isabella said nothing. She let the words occupy the space they needed. "I swore I would never let that happen to me." He looked at the whiskey glass but didn't touch it. "That I would never give anyone the power to erase me that way. That any relationship I had would be based on terms I controlled completely." "And so you built a marriage that was proof against that?" "I thought so." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the others they had shared. It wasn't the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who have much to say and are calibrating how much is safe. "Henrique," she said, with a kindness that wasn't weakness, "what your mother did to your father is not what I would do to you, not because I am perfect or because I am different from her in every sense, but because I entered this house knowing exactly what it was and what it wasn't, and instead of destroying myself with that, I learned to build myself." He looked at her for a long time, and then said, with a voice that was stripped of all the layers that usually composed it, "I know, I see that, and that is exactly what scares me." Isabella stayed with that phrase for a moment. "Why?" "Because it means I was wrong, about what I needed, about what I wanted." A difficult pause. "About you." She felt the weight of those words with all the precision they deserved, and she also felt with the same clarity that this was not the moment to dissolve into them, that there was something very important that needed to be said, and that she was the only one who could say it. "I hear what you are telling me," she said calmly, "and I won't pretend it doesn't matter. It matters. But, Henrique," she leaned slightly forward, her elbows on the table, "you humiliated me before 300 people. You treated me as invisible for months. That doesn't disappear because you had a difficult night and were honest in the kitchen at 2 in the morning." He did not defend himself. He sat looking at her with that new expression, that of the man without the walls. "I know," he said, and the two words had a weight she hadn't heard in him before. "So now you know what I know," she said, getting up. "And the next choices are yours, not mine." She picked up the water glass, said goodnight with the tranquility of someone completely planted in their own center, and went back to the hallway. She climbed the stairs slowly, and only when she reached her room and closed the door did she let her hands tremble slightly. Not from fear, not from sadness, but from the immense effort of having been honest without losing herself. The 10 days that followed the night in the kitchen were the strangest of the 7 months of marriage. Henrique did not return to the subject. He did not seek new conversations. He did not try to pick up the thread of what had been said in the early hours of Thursday. But he also didn't return to the absolute silence of the first months. It was as if he were inhabiting an intermediate space, present in a new way, without yet knowing what to do with that presence. Isabella observed him without haste. She had learned in those months not to rush things that needed time. She continued her routine, the consultancy, the piano, the garden, the books. She continued being herself with the consistency she had built patiently, without depending on the variation of his mood or his rhythm, to stay on her feet. The consultancy project was delivered the following Tuesday, with a result that Dr. Fernanda described as the best work you've ever done. The partners of the family company approved the new governance structure unanimously, the first unanimous decision in 4 years. Isabella celebrated alone, with a glass of wine in the garden and the sound of the wind in the aromatic herbs she had planted, and felt that specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of something made with one's own hands. When Enrique arrived that night, and Patricia had already transmitted the news of the project's success, because Patricia knew everything, it was part of her job, he went to the garden where Isabella still was and said without preamble, "Congratulations on the project." "Thank you," she replied, and there was a completeness in the answer that needed nothing else. He stood near the garden entrance for a moment, looking at the herbs she had planted with an expression she was still learning to read, that specific mixture of recognition and disorientation that was his version of being emotionally outside controlled ground. "You did all this," he said, indicating the garden with a small gesture. "Month by month." She looked at the plants. "It helps to have something that responds to care." He was silent for a time she didn't measure. And then he said, "I want to try." She raised her eyes to him. "I know I don't have the right to simply say that and expect it to work," he continued, and there was a quality in that speech she recognized as the real cost he was paying to talk like that. "I know that what happened at the engagement, the wedding, in the first months, it isn't erased. It isn't fixed with a conversation in the kitchen or 10 days of different behavior." "It isn't," she confirmed with direct kindness. "But," he made a pause that had the weight of a turning point, "I don't want to protect myself from you anymore, and that is a change I needed 7 months to manage to say out loud." Isabella stayed with those words for a moment. There was a part of her that had waited for this, not with desperation, not with dependence, but with the quiet awareness that that man had something real inside him that fear had locked away. And there was another part of her, equally real, that knew that true feelings and the right to a new beginning are distinct things that don't necessarily walk together. "Enrique," she said, standing up from the stone where she was sitting and facing him, "I need you to understand something clearly." He looked at her with total attention, that attention she had waited months to see directed at her. "I grew up here." She made a gesture toward the house, the garden, all of it. "Not in the sense that this mansion created me, in the sense that I created myself within it. I took a situation that began as humiliation and made it a process of becoming more whole. And I am proud of that. You should be. And because I am," she continued, without letting his sentence divert the course, "I cannot build anything new on the foundation of what was done, not out of spite, not out of revenge, out of respect for what it cost me to get here." He was silent. It wasn't the defensive silence from before. It was the silence of someone listening for real. "What you are saying is that you don't want to try." "I am saying," she said, with a firmness that was at once soft and unshakable, "that if there is a new beginning between us, it needs to be exactly that. A beginning, not a continuation of what was agreed at the Fasano, not a recovery of what there was. Something that never existed yet, built in a different way with both people being honest about who they are now." He looked at her for a long time, and there was in that look something she had waited to see since the beginning, not calculated desire, not strategic recognition. There was respect, the kind that isn't performative, that serves no purpose other than being true. "And do you want that?" he asked. "To build something different?" It was the most honest question he had asked in 7 months, and she received it with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing the answer, not softening the edges to make the moment easier. She stayed with it for a real time before speaking. "I don't know yet," she said finally. And you will need to learn to exist in that I don't know, without trying to control it. It was an answer that could have destroyed the moment, but it didn't. Because Henrique Vargas Neto, for the first time in 42 years of life, didn't try to control what he couldn't control. He stood in the garden his wife had built with her own hands, with the aromatic herbs around and the August cold on his skin, and said only, "That's fine." 2 words, the same ones he had said when he learned about the consultancy project, but with a completely different texture. This time they weren't functional indifference, they were acceptance, the first he had genuinely offered to someone in a long time. Isabella nodded slightly, and then, without drama, without tears, without any of the excesses that moment could have had, she went back inside the house. He stayed in the garden for a few more minutes, looking at the plants she had cultivated, at the small pots arranged with care next to the herbs, at the visible sign that someone had invested attention and persistence in a place he had abandoned. And for the first time in a long time, Henrique Vargas Neto didn't know what would come next. And instead of being terrifying as it had always been, that uncertainty had the strange and new texture of something that looked, however timidly, like hope. He stayed in the garden until the August cold became unbearable. When he entered the mansion, the house was silent, all the lights out except for the one in the corridor leading to her room, a thread of golden light under the closed door. He climbed the stairs slowly, stopped for a second before that door, and placed his forehead against the cold wood for a brief moment that no one saw, and that didn't need to be seen by anyone. It was a gesture without an audience, and perhaps for that reason it was the most honest he had made in years. Then he went to his own room, and for the first time in many nights, he didn't open any reports, didn't answer any emails, didn't plan the next morning. He just lay in the dark and stayed quiet with what there was. And what there was, he was finally learning, was enough to start. 3 months after winter, spring arrived in São Paulo with that slightly chaotic exuberance the city has, when the cold yields, yellow IP flowers on the Jardins sidewalks, the noise of the city growing back, and the internal garden of the Higienopolis mansion, transformed by seasonality into a more vivid version of itself. Isabella had spent September caring for the plants with the same constancy as always, and for the first time there was another person involved in the process, not conducting, not leading, but present. Henrique had begun to appear in the garden on weekend mornings, at first only with coffee, sitting on the stone where she used to settle, observing. Then, on an October afternoon, he had asked the name of one of the herbs. It was time, she had replied, and the following week he had arrived with 2 new pots bought at an organic fair he had discovered existed 6 blocks from the mansion. He hadn't made a declaration out of it. He had just placed the pots next to the others and gone back inside, and she had smiled alone, turning away so he wouldn't see. The new beginning, because that's what was happening, although neither had formally declared it, was made of small gestures and consistency. Henrique had begun to dine at home with much more regularity. The dinners had changed, not dramatically, but in a way that mattered. There was conversation now, sometimes technical, sometimes about the books both were reading, sometimes about nothing particularly important, which was, paradoxically, the hardest kind of conversation for him and the most revealing for her. Carolina had returned from Lisbon for a 2-week visit and had noticed the difference immediately. At a dinner for 3, she had observed her brother listen to Isabella tell about a new project she had accepted, this time as an independent consultant with her own name, and had said with the direct frankness that was her trademark, "You are different, Henrique." And he had replied, without looking away from Isabella, "I am learning." Carolina had winked at Isabella discreetly. Isabella had held back her smile with effort. Monteiro Agro had recovered. The restructuring conducted by the Vargas Group had been successful, and Isabella's father, who had aged visibly in the years before the deal, had in his eyes, when he visited her in October, something she had had difficulty naming before recognizing, pride that no longer depended on the despair of saving what was. It was the simplest and most solid pride of seeing what exists working. Isabella had visited the family farm in the interior of São Paulo in September, for the first time since the wedding. She had walked through the fields with her father on a silent afternoon, and he had said in a pause during the walk, without looking at her directly, "I know what you did, and I know how much it cost." She had taken his hand and didn't respond in words because no words were necessary. The field around them was answer enough. Henrique had gone to pick her up at the airport when she returned from there. He had been at a business dinner that night and had cancelled dessert to arrive on time. She had seen him standing at the arrivals with that posture she now knew how to read so well, composed on the surface, attentive underneath, and had felt something she was no longer afraid to call by its name. In the car back, he had said, "How was it?" "Necessary," she replied. "And good." "And your father?" "Better." A pause. "You went to the farm with him in September." He was silent for a second. "How do you know?" "My father told me." She slightly turned her head to look at him. "You spent an entire afternoon with him without telling me." "I didn't want you to think I was being calculated about it." "And weren't you?" A pause that was half a contained smile. "I was a little," she laughed. It was a new sound in that car, genuine, without performance, without the protective layer she had maintained for months. And Henrique heard her, with that attention she was still learning to receive, as something that turns toward her with the naturalness of someone who no longer needs to resist. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Isabella would be the first to say that. There was work still, there were conversations that needed courage, there were habits of his that needed to be unlearned, and habits of hers that needed space to exist. There was a past that would not be rewritten, only integrated. The sentence from the Fasano, that "I will never touch you," that had weighed like a stone in the first months, had not disappeared. It was stored in a drawer, they both knew where it was. But it was no longer what defined what was between them. What was between them was something that was built despite everything, because of the difficulties, not on the margins of them. It was a story of two people who had arrived there by twisted paths and who were choosing, one day at a time, to build something that no formal agreement could have produced. In the first week of November, on a spring afternoon with the sun coming in obliquely through the library window, Isabella was reading when Henrique entered with the 2 coffees and settled into the opposite armchair. The distance between them much smaller than it had been on that Sunday in June, when everything had begun to change. They stayed in silence for a while, each with their book, with the distant sound of the city outside. At some point, without announcement and without ceremony, his hand stretched over the arm of the chair and found hers. Just that. No declaration, no dramaturgy. His hand over hers, with the simple and unequivocal weight of someone who has finally arrived where they needed to arrive. Isabella turned the page of the book with her free hand. She did not take the other one from under his. And they stayed like that in silence, while the afternoon advanced over São Paulo with that particular light the city has when it decides to be generous, golden, wide, without any hurry at all. If you made it this far, you know that stories like Isabella and Henrique's are not about perfection. They are about the courage to rebuild yourself when everything seems against you, and about the choice, always renewed, to keep going. If this narrative touched something in you, leave your like and share it with those who also need to hear that new beginnings are possible, even within the most unlikely places. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of lives that transform one choice at a time. And tell us in the comments, did you root for them from the beginning, or did you have doubts along the way? We read everything, and each of your comments makes this story continue to be worth telling. End of story.